At precisely 3:07 p.m., a shot echoed across my ranch. A single rifle crack that sliced through the auctioneer's droning voice halted the bidding war at $825,000 and made Karen Buckley, the HOA president in a lavender pantsuit, drop her clipboard and scream with a shrill voice that he's armed. She wasn't wrong. I was. But it wasn't what she thought. Behind me, the banner still read bank-approved HOA foreclosure auction. In front of me stood 27 confused strangers, half holding numbered paddles, the other half holding mimosas. All eyes turned to me as I stood on my own porch, boots dusty, beard heavy, and holding a freshly fired starter pistol from my dad's track coaching days. "This is my land," I said calmly. And that wasn't a warning shot. That was the only shot you're gonna get. My name is Wes Harland, 42 years old, and I'm the quiet owner of a 17-acre ranch in Blue Brush Hollow, a supposedly peaceful HOA-controlled community in northern Arizona. I inherited this place from my father, along with a lifetime supply of canned peaches, a 1967 Ford F-100, and an understanding that peace comes from keeping to yourself. But HOA President Karen Buckley, recently divorced and newly emboldened by a self-issued executive directive clause, had other plans for me and my property. To her, I was non-compliant rural clutter. My refusal to attend HOA meetings, my vintage windmill, the 3 rescue goats she called a legally unregistered emotional support livestock, and my failure to paint the barn a soothing beige approved by HOA Subcommittee 4 made me public enemy number 1 in her perfectly manicured world. And then my father died. I left town for 4 days to bury him in Missouri, thinking my property would be safe for less than a week. That was when Karen struck like a vulture circling dying prey. On day 1 of my absence, Karen filed an emergency abandonment report with the county, claiming with fake concern that the property appeared suddenly vacant and potentially hazardous. On day 2, she padlocked my front gate with a heavy chain and an official-looking notice she'd printed herself. By day 3, she'd pushed a motion through the HOA board via text message votes, declaring the property in long-term non-compliance forfeiture, whatever that meant in her twisted interpretation of property law. On day 4, while I was standing at my father's funeral listening to Amazing Grace on a church organ, Karen hired an auctioneer, printed glossy flyers, and scheduled a neighborhood restoration auction for that Saturday. She even staged my ranch with borrowed furniture from her real estate friend, told prospective buyers I had fled tax fraud charges, and listed the property as distressed but charming with endless potential. All while my father's ashes were still cooling in an urn beside that same church organ where we'd said our final goodbyes. I returned home that Saturday afternoon to find my long driveway packed with Teslas and wine moms in yoga pants sipping rose in my pasture like it was some kind of vineyard tour. A man in a brand new cowboy hat was actually measuring my front porch, telling his wife in an excited voice that a hot tub would definitely fit there. Then I saw Karen holding court like a queen. She was perched on a folding chair under a white canopy, holding a clipboard like it was a royal scepter, barking orders at a teenager adjusting the auction sign. Her voice carried that special tone of someone who'd found their calling in making other people miserable. When I demanded answers, pushing through the crowd of confused bidders, Karen smirked with such satisfaction it made my blood boil. She handed me a printed packet labeled Emergency Resolution 44B Property Recovery for Community Wellness. It had been signed by her 4 times, in different colored pens, as if that would make it more official. When I called the sheriff from my cell phone, Karen intercepted, walking over with her arms crossed, and claimed in her most concerned citizen voice that I was the trespasser on this property. When I called the county office, she grabbed her own phone and claimed to whoever would listen that I was mentally unwell and possibly dangerous. So I went into my barn, my hands shaking with controlled rage. And I came out with a starter pistol, my legal deed, and a notarized affidavit from my late father that I'd grabbed from my truck. The gunshot wasn't aimed at anyone, of course. It hit an old metal bucket hanging on the porch, denting it like a gong of justice that rang across my property. Property auction is off, I growled in a voice I hardly recognized as my own. Anyone past that fence line in 60 seconds is trespassing on private property. People froze like deer in headlights. Some gasped dramatically. Karen shrieked in her most theatrical voice that I was unstable and that I had goats, as if the goats were somehow relevant to my mental state. But one bidder, an off-duty Border Patrol agent named Rick, walked up to me slowly with his hands visible and said in a respectful tone that he'd like to shake my hand, sir. That handshake was the turning tide that changed everything. The sheriff arrived minutes later, lights flashing but no siren. After seeing my documents and listening to my explanation, he turned to Karen and asked in a bewildered voice if she had seriously forged a foreclosure document using Comic Sans font. Turns out, Karen had created fake bylaws with made-up legal language she'd copied from the internet. She'd faked board meeting minutes for meetings that never happened. And she'd been illegally collecting administrative fees from HOA members for years, depositing them into her personal vacation fund account. Her auction wasn't just unethical or a misunderstanding. It was straight-up felony fraud with a side of embezzlement. The HOA board members who'd shown up for the free wine suddenly turned on her immediately, each one claiming in increasingly panicked voices that they recalled none of the votes she claimed happened. They'd never approved any emergency measures. They'd never even heard of Resolution 44B. Karen was arrested on the spot for document forgery, impersonating a public official, and unauthorized seizure of private property. As the officer read her rights in that monotone voice cops use, her face went from lavender to match her pantsuit to white as printer paper. As she was led away in handcuffs, still protesting in an increasingly hysterical voice about property values and community standards, one of my goats broke free from the barn and wandered over to her dropped clipboard. The goat looked at it thoughtfully for a moment, then pooped directly on it. A small, steaming punctuation mark on her fake authority. The auctioneer, who'd been standing frozen this whole time, asked nervously if he should pack up his podium. I told him he was welcome to auction off Karen's folding chair if he wanted. He declined and left quickly. Rick, the Border Patrol agent, stayed behind to help me clear everyone off my property. He told me his own HOA had tried something similar with his elderly neighbor, though nothing quite this brazen. We shared a beer on my porch afterward, watching the last of the Teslas navigate back down my dusty driveway. 3 weeks later, I got a call from the district attorney's office. The investigator on the phone had that excited tone of someone who just uncovered a goldmine of evidence. Karen had been charged with 8 separate counts, including conspiracy to commit real estate fraud, wire fraud, and racketeering. The prosecutor said in a pleased voice that they'd found evidence of her doing this twice before in other neighborhoods, though neither attempt had gotten as far as mine. They'd seized her computer and found spreadsheets where she'd been tracking property values in the HOA for years, marking certain homes as acquisition targets. Mine was highlighted in red with notes that said stubborn but high value and wait for opportunity. My father's obituary was actually bookmarked in her browser history. The investigation revealed she'd been running this scheme with her cousin who worked at a title company. He'd been feeding her information about property liens and helping her create official-looking documents. The cousin flipped on her immediately when faced with his own charges, providing investigators with 3 years' worth of text messages where Karen detailed her plans to build what she called her real estate empire one forced sale at a time. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Karen showed up every day in a different pastel outfit, as if the right shade of mint green might sway the jury. Her lawyer, a nervous man who kept adjusting his glasses, tried to argue she was simply an overzealous community volunteer who'd gotten confused about property law. But the Comic Sans foreclosure document sealed her fate. The judge actually laughed when it was presented as evidence. Not a chuckle, but a full laugh that echoed through the courtroom while Karen's face turned the color of an overripe tomato. The prosecution brought in witness after witness. The teenager who'd helped set up the auction sign testified in a shaky voice that Karen had paid him $200 cash and told him to say the property was abandoned if anyone asked. The auctioneer revealed Karen had promised him double his usual commission if he could get the bidding over $1 million. Even her ex-husband showed up, testifying with barely contained glee that she'd tried similar schemes during their marriage, which is partly why he divorced her. My testimony was simple. I showed photos of my father's funeral program with the date, my plane tickets, and the receipt for his burial plot. I explained in a steady voice how I'd returned to find strangers drinking wine in my pasture while measuring my home for renovations. The jury members looked horrified when I described finding my father's tool shed already being emptied by someone Karen had told that everything was included in the sale. Karen took the stand on day 9, against her lawyer's advice. She spoke in her fake sweet voice about community improvement and property values. But when the prosecutor asked her why she'd forged my signature 17 times on various documents, she broke down and screamed that people like me were ruining the neighborhood aesthetic with our rustic lifestyle choices. The court reporter actually asked her to repeat that last part because she couldn't believe what she'd heard. Karen was sentenced to 14 months in minimum security prison, 3 years probation, and ordered to pay restitution of $87,000 to various HOA members she'd scammed over the years. She was also permanently banned from serving on any HOA board in the state. When the judge read the sentence, specifically emphasizing the HOA ban, she fainted dramatically, falling sideways off her chair while her lawyer tried unsuccessfully to catch her, managing only to grab her purse as she hit the courtroom floor with a thud.